Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giles Gunn. I'm a professor of English and of Global and International Studies and director of the English Department's new American Cultures and Global Context Center. It's my great pleasure, along with my colleague and co-director of the project supporting this lecture, Carl Gutierrez-Jones, chairman of the Department of English, to welcome you to this, the third in a series of 4 lectures organized around the general topic of America and the reshaping of a new world order, normative implications, cultural constraints. Supported by a special endowment devoted to critical issues in America and administered by the Office of the Provost College of Letters and Science, this lecture series, which has already brought to campus the great African writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o and the distinguished American historian of East Asia and modern Japan, John Dower, is but one in a variety of programs related to this general topic, and that include or have included as well a film series on docudramas and documentaries, a UC system-wide faculty roundtable on America and world order, and forthcoming at the end of April, an international conference. The series as a whole, as many of you know, is co-sponsored by the English Department's new American Cultures and Global Context Center, as well as the university's program in Global and International Studies. We've also had considerable help in publicity and support in this and in all of our other programming from the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. The topic of this overall set of programs was suggested to us by the calamitous events associated with September 11, 2001. But it obviously encompasses a set of issues that extend much farther back in the American past, in the American and in fact in the global past. Just as the Second World War in Iraq, or for that matter, the First, scarcely represented the first time in history that the United States has sought to take a direct or indirect hand in shaping structures of global governance, so many of its people have clearly felt, from the very first years of European settlement, that they were called to construct on the North American continent a set of socio-political and religious arrangements that might well serve as a model for the reformation of the rest of the world. While such global ambitions have over the centuries hardly escaped international scrutiny or even censure, our current interest in this subject is neither at the outset to challenge America's right to see itself, as indeed some of its citizens do, as a kind of city upon a hill, or to determine whether under given conditions America has had or now has or should have the right to turn its own vision of itself as an imitable model into some sort of exportable commodity. Our primary interest in this project is rather to try to figure out what such predispositions and pretensions now mean in the kind of world in which they are being deployed after 9/11. While America's newest set of aspirations to influence global reordering and governance has clearly met, both here and throughout the world, with a decidedly mixed and in many instances hostile, in others favorable response, we are seeking in these various programs to focus attention on a particularly problematic element. On, that is, the striking degree to which the normative claims supporting this geopolitical aspiration, that is, the ethical, legal, historical, and religious claims, are couched in a language that is decidedly figurative, symbolic, even aesthetic. That is to say, the debate about global governance and America's role in its future are being framed in terms that are metaphorical through and through. The global atmosphere is full of discourse about old Europe versus new America, axes of evil, clashes of civilization, wars against terror, defined by Manichaean oppositions between those for us and those against us, nuclear weapons redescribed as composing a boutique of armaments needed to make warfare more supple, flexible, and responsive, democracy redefined as identical with America, American values reconceived as universals. But what does this reversion to image and trope to frame international issues and conduct geopolitical business really mean? Why should it matter? What difference does it make? and who should care? How much is culture, as opposed to, say, economics, politics, and social theory, if they can be divided at all, driving the engines of the new American imperium? These are the kinds of questions we want to bring out of the rhetorical fog and into critical view, as a way of illuminating the extent to which such discourse is no mere rhetorical embellishment of this effort to reform global governance, but part of what is at stake in its very conception and execution. To help us move more deeply into these considerations, we have been extraordinarily fortunate to persuade one of the world's experts on issues of global governance, Professor Mary Kaldor of the London School of Economics, to join us today and tomorrow. Professor Kaldor will actually be making two presentations during her visit to Santa Barbara. The first, her talk this afternoon. The second, a seminar discussion scheduled for tomorrow at 1 in South Hall 2635, and open to the public as well as to students and faculty, a seminar discussion on the study of the global. The study of the global is something in which Professor Kaldor is deeply involved as Director of Program on Global Civil Society for the Center of the Study of Global Governance at the London School of Economics, where she also holds appointments in the Center for the Study of Human Rights. Both of these institutional residencies reflect her long interest in international conflict, humanitarian intervention, new wars, the politics of oil, and the regions of the Trans-Caucasus and the Middle East. Professor Kaldor is the co-editor of Democratization in Central and Eastern Europe and of Global Civil Society 2001, and most recently Global Civil Society 2003, and the author of numerous articles such as Civilizing Globalization, the Implications of the Battle in Seattle, Balkan Reconstruction, Economic Aspects, Eastern Enlargement and Democracy, Europe at the Millennium, The Structure of Conflict, The Imaginary War, Understanding East-West Conflict, and Three Scenarios for the 21st Century. Her latest books are New and Old Wars, Organized Violence in a Global Era, published in 1999, and just published in the spring of this past year, Global Civil Society, An Answer to War. In this newest book, Professor Kaldor speaks of global civil society as a concept as well as a fact, by means of which one may hope to open spaces for fresh global conversation, free of fear, as she writes, superstition and prejudice. A conversation in which we talk about our moral concerns, our passions, as well as thinking through the best way to solve problems. A conversation in which the participants are not just those who can travel and communicate along long distances, but also ordinary men, women, and children. Such islands of engagement, as she describes them, are exactly what her own work is designed to produce, in the hope that these islands, as she says in the last sentence of her new book, can lead to change. It is a privilege to introduce Professor Mary Kaldor, who will be speaking on American military power versus cosmopolitanism. Professor Kaldor.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm really very pleased to be here, and I can tell you that it's a great relief if you come from outside this country and if you live in Europe or even elsewhere and you watch the television, to find that when you actually get to America, the reality of what you see on your television is very different, that there are still nice, open, reasoning people. So I'm really glad I came here just to find out that reality isn't always as it appears. And in a way, that's the theme of today's talk, because I really want to talk about the way our ideas of power are out of touch with today's realities, and very much along the lines that Professor Gunn was talking about. I think we have a tendency to think of power as it was at the end of the Second World War. And that view of power, from dating back to 1945, I think profoundly shapes political culture and institutions, especially in this country. And in particular, what I want to argue is that military capabilities are not the same as power. That we have this view of power in which the victory in 1945 shaped world order, and we find it very difficult to get away from that view. What I want to argue is that nowadays, what's very, very difficult is to use military power in the way that Clausewitz talked about military power. He said that what military power was about, what war was about, was imposing your will on an opponent. And the American strategist Thomas Schelling referred to this idea as compellence. Now, I think that nowadays the use of military power can be very destructive, and it can achieve certain purposes, but it's extremely difficult to use military power to impose your will on others. And in a way, that's what we're discovering in Iraq, and that's the theme of what I want to talk about. In a way, I think part of the problem in the world today is that perceptions of military power, perceptions of American power, are actually perceptions that are out of touch with what is really happening, with reality on the ground. I want to argue that America can't be powerful because of military capabilities, or if it is powerful because of its military capabilities, it's only because we believe it's powerful. And that actually, if America really wanted to be powerful in the sense of being able to impose its will, it would do so much better through a cosmopolitan approach than through its current, more militaristic approach. And that's really the theme of what I'm going to say. But before developing this argument, I'd like to make some general remarks about these big issues, globalization, the state, and war. It seems to me that the debate about globalization is actually not so much a debate about globalization as a debate about the future of the nation state. We use the term globalization to mean something's happening to the state. And as those of you who study globalization will know very well, on the one hand, there are enthusiastic globalizers like Thomas Friedman or Kenneth Omai who say globalization means the end of the nation state, the world is becoming one huge self-regulating market. And there are critics of globalization who say this global market, the spread of multinational corporations, all these things only happened because states deliberately adopted policies that made it happen. They deliberately decided to liberalize movements of capital. They deliberately decided to privatize. And in fact, globalization can be reversed. And there's yet a third school of thought, which is very prominent in my university, the London School of Economics, which says, yes, globalization is doing something to the nation state, but it neither means the end of the nation state nor the retention of the nation state. What it means is that the nation state is changing. And that's actually my position. But the question that I want to ask is, how is the nation state changing? What does it mean to say that globalization, greater interconnectedness in economic, political, cultural ways is changing the nature of the nation state? Well, my argument, which goes off in a way a little bit at a tangent, is to say that the changes in the nature of the state fundamentally has to do with changes in the nature of warfare. That at the heart of the creation of the modern state was war. And this is what's changing. And it's actually those changes in the nature of warfare that has opened up the possibilities of globalization and global governance, not the other way around. I think it's no accident that we started to talk about globalization only after the end of the Cold War, only after a period in which world relations were structured along military lines. And so for me, I would say at the heart is the change in the nation state, but the change in the nation state has something to do with changes in the role of the military and in the role of warfare, and it's that which opens up the possibilities of globalization. So let me just say, before I start talking about what those changes are, let me just say very briefly what I think was the relationship between the state and war. And this comes from all kinds of authors like Michael Mann or Charles Tilly. What I think, war was absolutely central in the formation of modern nation states, and it was central to that process of creating a monopoly of legitimate violence, which is how Weber defined the state. And the process involved a combination of things. Kings went to war, they had to regularize borrowing so they could pay for wars, so they had to set up banking systems. They had to increase taxation, so they had to improve the efficiency of taxation. That meant they had to pacify places and introduce a rule of law, because otherwise people would prefer to give money to highwaymen than to tax collectors. They had to improve administrative efficiency. They had to get rid of private armies, which belonged to lords and other groupings. And a whole process went on in which you got a combination of things, a strengthening of the state, an increasing pacification at home, and war abroad. Tilly talks about, in the West at any rate, not necessarily in the East, a kind of bargain in which gradually over time people agreed to pay taxes, they agreed to risk their lives in war in exchange for certain rights they acquired in peacetime. And at the same time, war became very organized. It became the business of states. Soldiers started to wear uniforms so they could be recognized as the agents of the state. And we got the codification of laws of war. So there was an idea that soldiers, as legitimate agents of violence, fought according to certain rules. And we could tell the difference between a hero and a criminal, a legitimate killer and a common murderer. So this is the process that international relations theorists call of creating what they call the Great Divide. The idea that within the nation state we have the rule of law, we have civil society, we have gradually democracy, and outside we have what they call the state of nature, the possibility of war. And this is also, of course, reflected in the agents of violence. Inside we have police, the law enforcers. Outside, we have soldiers who wage war. And I think what's key, gosh, honestly, this is a bit funny the way I'll keep away. You can hear me if I keep away. I think what's key to globalization is that it's about the breakdown of this inside-outside distinction. It's about that in a sense, what we're seeing is a double movement. On the one hand, we're seeing an enormous growth in international agreements of all kinds, of the extension of international law, and indeed the growth of a global civil society. On the other hand, we're seeing warfare, whether it's the form of terrorism or whatever, or organized crime increasingly coming inside. So in a way, this is the big change, that clear distinction on the borders of the state between inside and outside is eroding. But of course it's eroding in very different ways, and the nature of the state is changing in different ways. And I think one of the ways of thinking about this is to think about how states have reacted to changes in warfare. And before I talk specifically about different types of warfare, which I'm going to do in a minute, I'd like to say two things that I think have changed in a very profound way. which is the key to the changing nature of war, which then in turn affects the changing nature of the state. One is simply the growing destructiveness of all types of military technology, and it's that which makes compellence so difficult. It's extremely difficult nowadays, even if you have the vast capabilities of the United States, and I'll spell this out more in a little while, to establish a clear military advantage over an armed opponent with military technology. And indeed, my view is that actually World War II, as war became more professionalized, more a business of the state, it also became more and more extreme. Science and technology was more and more applied to it. And in my view, World War II was the last great war of the traditional statist kind, which involved destruction of such a scale. It's inconceivable that we could have a war of that type again. If you think about the numbers of people that were killed in the Second World War, something of the order of 35 million people, it's just inconceivable that that could be repeated. So that's one change. One change is simply about military technology and the difficulty of acquiring a military advantage. But linked to that is another very profound change, which is the growth of norms against war, rather like 100 or 200 years ago we had the growth of norms against slavery. And those are both formal norms in the sense that they're embodied in international law, starting with the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, and then Nuremberg after the Second World War and the United Nations Charter. But also, as you've seen in the post-Second World War period, the growth of a worldwide peace movement, which reacted against Vietnam, that reacted against the Cold War, and that had probably its biggest ever expression on February the 15th this year, when some 11 million people demonstrated worldwide against the Iraq War. And I think linked to the growing peace movement has, of course, been the growth of human rights norms and the growth of human rights movements, human rights being embodied in international treaties, and the sense that if violations of human rights are wrong, how is it possible to justify war? And I think this goes very deeply to the kind of discourse problem that Professor Gunn was talking about, because there is a view that war is legitimate killing, and so deaths in war are not seen as the same as violations in human rights. But increasingly, to large numbers of people, they are. And I think this partly explains the enormous difference in the discourse between people like Bush and Blair and everybody else. I'll just give you two examples. One would be the Israel-Palestine war, a continuing conflict, where in the last 2 or 3 years, many more Palestinian civilians, I'm not talking about military casualties, have been killed than have Israeli civilians killed by Palestinian suicide bombers. I don't by any means want to say that makes Palestinian suicide bombers justifiable, not a bit of it. But seen from an Israeli perspective, and very often seen by those who pursue this, there's a huge difference between the killing of civilians when it's done by legitimate agents of the state in an attempt to deal with Palestinian suicide bombers than non-state actors killing civilians. So they're seen somehow as morally different. Exactly the same argument, I think, can be carried out in relation to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. If you take Iraq as an example, civilian casualties during the Iraq War are estimated at around 13,000. That doesn't include military casualties, which nobody's actually counted. We don't know how many soldiers, Iraqi soldiers, died. Now, 13,000 casualties, as the Pentagon says quite rightly, is actually very low by the standards of war. And the Pentagon went to great lengths to try to minimize civilian casualties. But the problem is that most of the world does not see this any longer in terms of the standards of war. So that 13,000 casualties by the standards of human rights violations seems extremely high. And so I think that disconnect in the way people think about war is very, very critical nowadays. So I think to understand the changing nature of warfare, you have to understand that contemporary wars, in a way, are ways of getting around these two problems: the unacceptability of deaths in war and also the growing equalization of military technology. And what I would argue is that different types of wars, in a way, reflect different types of states. And in a way, these different types of states are different ways, one could say, of dealing with, responding to, and indeed contributing to globalization. So let me talk about two types of wars. I could mention others, but these are the two main types. The first type is one that I've written about extensively, and I will try not to talk at great length about it, which is what I call new wars. New wars are the sorts of wars that one saw in Bosnia, Kosovo, now currently in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example. And these wars are associated with what in the political science jargon are known as weak or failing states. What I would argue is that new wars typically are wars which are going through exactly the opposite of the process I described in relation to wars and state building. These are wars of state unbuilding, if you like, or state unraveling. They take place in states where already the tax base has been eroded, where public spending has been cut, perhaps under the impact of IMF pressures, where governments have been often unable to pay their soldiers and their police, and so private groups have begun, either bits of the military forces have broken off, or organised crime groups or paramilitary groups have started to operate, where governments have increasingly lost their legitimacy, and where, in a sense, the monopoly of legitimate violence is beginning to break down. And actually what new wars do is to speed up that process. I used the term new wars, which was in a sense an admission of failure, because I couldn't think of a better term. And some people refer to these wars as civil wars. I find the term very not very appropriate, because precisely because of the breakdown of the distinction between inside and outside. It assumes that these wars are inside and something else is going on outside. In fact, quite apart from the fact that these are wars of state unraveling, they generally tend to involve very many global actors. They tend to involve diaspora groups, foreign mercenaries, international agencies. They're very global as well as being very local. Another term people use is privatized wars. They say these are wars fought by private agents. Again, I'm not very happy with that either, precisely because these are wars where states are unraveling. It's very difficult to distinguish between what's state and what's non-state. And in fact, the people who fight these wars are usually networks of both state and non-state actors. So I ended up calling them new as opposed to old. There are several points to make about new wars. One is that they tend to be fought, and I could talk about that at greater length, but for the reasons of this talk I don't want to. They tend to be fought for purposes of identity, whether this is ethnic, religious, tribal, but it's groups who have a claim on the state in the name of identity. They involve, as I said, networks of state and non-state actors that cross borders. People from the diaspora, people abroad. These are the people who fight. They also tend to be financed by all kinds of criminal sources. These are these are societies where taxation has fallen, and many of the sources of finance are war-related sources, whether it's loot and plunder, whether it's setting up a checkpoint to be sure that you can force people to exchange their assets for necessities, whether it's taxing the diaspora, whether it's taxing humanitarian aid, whether it's illegal commodities. They're all, in a sense, war-related, semi-criminal or semi-criminal activities. And that's why a number of writers, Paul Collier from the World Bank and others, have argued that the purpose of these wars is greed, that they're money-making operations. I'm not convinced of that. I think they're ideological. Whether they get engaged in these activities as a way of financing wars, or whether, in fact, they get engaged in war as a way, providing a cover for their illegal activities, to me is not so relevant. What is important is that they kind of set up a new sort of political economy, a new kind of informal economy, which the state, or the remnants of the state, is deeply implicated in. But the key point I wanted to make is the nature of the violence. These wars, typically, you have very few battles. You very rarely see the warring parties fighting each other for the control of territories, which was the typical feature of old wars. Typically in these wars, violence is directed against civilians. And it's deliberate, because the way in which the various factions win is by controlling territory politically rather than military. And they control territory politically either by expelling or killing people of a different ethnicity or different identity, or political opponents. So ethnic cleansing, genocide, characteristics which you see in the new wars are not just side effects of wars, refugees and displaced persons, they're the objective of wars. And so the objective is political rather than military control, and it's done through violence directed against civilians. Nowadays there's a lot of talk about terror, which is in a way a rather unsatisfactory term, if by terror one means violence against civilians carried out by non-state actors, or one means the kind of activities in which Al-Qaeda engages, then I would say terror is one variant of new wars. But I think if you're thinking about Al-Qaeda, what makes it somewhat different from much of the violence that you're seeing in places like the Congo is, first of all, that it's even more anti-political. Extreme nationalists in the former Yugoslavia or even in the Congo are trying to control bits of territory. They're trying to control the state. What you see in the global terror is an attempt certainly at political mobilization, but it's not necessarily directed at any particular state objective. And secondly, I think in a way it's more spectacular. There's a lot of spectacular violence in many of the new wars, in the sense that, for example, the destruction of historic and cultural buildings, like the Taliban destroyed the Buddhist statues, or like in Bosnia, terrible destructions of beautiful mosques, so as to remove any kind of trace of the other. But I think the notion of using the spectacle, using the media in order to mobilize more people to your cause, to make people believe in a deep clash of civilizations, conflict, is very characteristic of Al-Qaeda and what's known as global terror. So that's the sort of war that's associated with what we call failing states and is linked very clearly to the undermining, unraveling of the state. A second type of war that I would like to talk about is what I call spectacle wars. And that is actually typical of the United States. Occasionally, Britain in the Falklands and together with the United States has got involved in spectacle wars too. But I think what you can say is that the reason why spectacle wars is characteristic of the United States is that the United States is actually, if you like, the last nation state, the only state with sufficient power to continue to act unilaterally in a military sense. What do I mean? So that's the state link of spectacle war. What do I mean by spectacle wars? Well, you all probably know what I mean. What I mean is high-tech wars, which are very visible on television, like the war, the bombing of Yugoslavia, the war in Afghanistan, and now the war in Iraq. And why do I call it a spectacle? Well, I call it spectacle war because it is a spectacle from the point of view of Americans. I said that I thought that World War II was the last great war of the traditional type, state war between organised armies. And I also said that I think the victory in that war underpinned was very important in establishing the legitimacy of the American state, not only within the United States, but globally. And I think that memory, the narrative based on the war, which has been reproduced throughout the Cold War period, has become deeply embedded in American political culture and American institutions. And the narrative is about the US saving Europe from the threat of totalitarianism and bringing democracy to Europe with the help of superior technology and know-how. And it's that narrative and that idea was sustained and deepened through the Cold War. I refer to the Cold War as imaginary war because what I have tried to argue is that what the Cold War did was to reproduce our memories of the Second World War, our ideas of the US global role in our imagination. We pretended to be at war for 50 years without actually going to war, though of course we did, and I'll say something about there was a real war, as in Vietnam and elsewhere. But, and indeed what I think happened in Vietnam was that precisely because it was a real war, it showed up the difficulties in a post-World War II period of going to war, both the difficulties of compellence, of imposing American order on Vietnam, and the difficulties with dealing with growing norms against war. So I think and that in a way, I think the experience of Vietnam underscored the importance of keeping the war imaginary. Spectacle war, I would say, is imaginary from the point of view of the Americans, but not imaginary from the point of view of the other side. It's imaginary from Americans because Americans don't have to risk their lives. Of course, lives are being risked in Iraq, but relatively at a very low level, not enough yet, at any rate, to really impinge. And people don't have to pay taxes. On the contrary, you get tax cuts. But what you can achieve with spectacle war, even with all this high technology, is actually very limited. Spectacle war can be extremely destructive, and it can achieve limited victories. For example, in Yugoslavia, it did achieve the Serbian withdrawal from Kosovo, but only after a double ethnic cleansing. First, the ethnic cleansing of the Albanians carried out under the cover of bombing, and then the reverse ethnic cleansing of Serbs. It did achieve the collapse of the Taliban, but it didn't achieve the capture of Osama bin Laden. And it did, of course, achieve the fall of Saddam Hussein, but not security in Iraq. And actually what I would argue is that spectacle war actually exacerbates the conditions that leads to new war or that leads to terror. And it does so both in an economic sense, in that it's immensely destructive of infrastructure and jobs. You saw this very much in Yugoslavia. It actually contributes to the criminalization of the economy. And it also does so more importantly in a political sense, in that it polarizes opinion and creates the kind of fear and hatred that's very typical of new wars. As a matter of fact, I meant to say when I talked about new wars one other point, that because of the criminalized economy and because violence is directed against civilians, actually new wars strengthen the conditions that led to the wars in the first place. what you get typically is, first of all, you get vested interest in continuing wars because your income is dependent on war-related activities. Secondly, the strength of the warring parties really depends on fear and hatred and insecurity. So new wars typically are very, very difficult to end because they create these groups of people who, both for political and economic reasons, have vested interests in future wars. And they're also very difficult to contain because they spread through criminal networks, they spread through the refugees and displaced persons and the problems they create, they spread through these extremist identity ideologies. And so this is why you have growing clusters of warfare in the Balkans, even now, despite all the efforts, in Central Asia, in Central Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in West Africa. So what I'm trying to say is that actually spectacle war really feeds into that. And if you think about any of these cases, you take Yugoslavia today, it contributed to criminalization, but more importantly, it contributed to that sense of victimhood. And what we see now is that we now have a very nationalist government in Yugoslavia that's actually dependent on Milosevic's party for its rule. So in a way, Milosevic is back in power. In Afghanistan, we have the terrible problems of warlordism. And in Iraq, I think, what we saw happening was a rapid transition from an authoritarian state to a failing state. And the risks in Iraq are not only that it's become a place that has attracted terrorists from all over the world, it's the place where you can fight jihad against America, but it's also giving rise to all kinds of localized conflicts on ethnic, tribal and religious grounds, all the sort of ingredients of new wars. Now, I could talk, these aren't the only types of wars. I mean, another type of war, which, if I had more time, I would talk about, would be, for example, what I call neo-modern wars, which are wars like the Russian war in Chechnya or India in Kashmir, where they are willing to risk casualties, they are trying to control territory, but they're simply not succeeding. And what you see happening is a long-term escalation, and in a way they're degenerating into new wars. But what I really want to emphasize now is, what do these different types of wars have in common? Well, I think, first of all, they are asymmetric. The Americans fight against much weaker opponents. The new wars, warring parties fight against civilians. Secondly, they all to some degree involve state unravelling. I talked about that in New Wars, but I think you can also argue that spectacle war does too. Spectacle war actually, as I said, involves tax cuts. It's a way of diverting attention for the reduced role of the state in all kinds of social problems. So I think it's a way of trying to maintain the legitimacy of the state while actually carrying out fewer and fewer of traditional state functions. But most importantly, I think what they reveal is that compellence is very difficult. You can't impose order on other places. But at the same time, that doesn't mean the wars don't have a point, and that's the big problem. The wars have a political point. The wars are methods of political mobilization. They are methods of sustaining the power of particular groups, whether it's the American administration or whether it's the warring parties in a new war. And so they have a rationale, but it's a political rationale, not a traditional military rationale. And that is the big problem. Because if you say compellence doesn't make sense, you might hope that people will learn the lesson and not therefore try to engage in compellence. But actually it might make sense from a political point of view, and I think that's the lesson of what goes on in Israel and Palestine. It's very hard to explain why the Israelis go on doing what they do in the West Bank and Gaza if you really believe they're trying to keep order and maintain security. But if you think it's working quite well to keep liquid in power and to mobilize more extreme sentiments, and likewise you can say exactly the same of the Palestinians. Suicide bombing doesn't make sense from the point of view of creating a Palestinian state, but it does make sense from the point of view of strengthening support for Hamas. And I think that kind of argument could be generalized. It may be that spectacle war makes no sense from the point of view of doing the things that Bush claims he would like to do, imposing democracy on Iraq, solving the problems of the Middle East, imposing order. But it might be very effective in the long run, in terms of giving a long-run idea of a war on terror, which Rumsfeld imagines will last 50 years, like the Cold War, and therefore sustaining power. And so I think one of the things one could imagine as a future scenario, which is very depressing, is spectacle war and new wars reinforcing each other, new wars and terror and the war on terror reinforcing each other for a very long time to come, undermining civil liberties and the rule of law. In other words, the outside moving inside. So so let me just finish, and I'll try not to be too long and get to the cosmopolitan bit. Is there an alternative? Well, I think one can talk about yet another type of state, which is very interesting, and forgive me if I sound a bit Eurocentric at this point, but I think one of the ways in which some states have actually managed to strengthen themselves is by recognizing the only way they strengthen themselves is by actually engaging in multilateral rulemaking and trying to influence multilateral rules. And that's in a way what the European Union is about. It's not a new political entity that's replacing nation states. On the contrary, it's a way in which the European nation states strengthen themselves. And so you could talk about a third type of state, which is sometimes called a multilateralist state, sometimes called a cosmopolitan state, sometimes called a globalizing state, which says, yes, we remain states, but actually instead of having a kind of absolute sovereignty and being able to engage in wars, we actually see our future in engaging in multilateral rules of the game. And I think one reason why it is typical of European states is precisely because in the Cold War era, the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact made it impossible for European states individually, with the possible exceptions of Britain and France, to fight wars unilaterally. And they had to start thinking about, in different ways, about how to work together in a multilateral system. Now, the reason I use the term cosmopolitan is really in reference to the Kantian peace project. This peace project is one in which you have nation states. They are based on what he called republican ideals, we might say democratic nowadays. They make a permanent peace treaty with each other. They create a federation, but the only element of the federation is that they won't go to war with each other. It involves nothing else. They have a permanent peace treaty. And overriding this permanent peace treaty is the notion of cosmopolitan right, which we would now call human rights. And I think the reason for the term cosmopolitan as opposed to humanism or something is because the term involves two elements. On the one hand, it means a commitment to universal values, the notion that human beings are equal. And on the other hand, it contains the idea of a respect for cultural difference and diversity. And I think the term cosmopolitan combines that. And my view is, this is my own interpretation, in Kant's Perpetual Peace, he talks about cosmopolitan right being confined to hospitality, the right of hospitality. And what he means by that is, I mean, when he was writing, he was concerned about Europeans discovering new countries and behaving badly to the natives, and equally the natives behaving badly to the Europeans. That you have to treat strangers politely. You don't have to integrate them, but you treat them politely. And what that means is that you respect the difference of cultures, but at the same time you treat them as human beings. So this is a system where states still retain sovereignty, but sovereignty is in some sense conditional on only using force within an international legal framework, and conditional on respecting certain international standards of human rights domestically. I think in such a system there is still a real role for military forces, but it's within an international framework, and it's military forces as containment rather than compellence. There are limits to what you can do with military forces, but you can use military forces to defend. I mean, you can use military forces to protect civilians, as in safe havens, humanitarian corridors. You can use military forces to catch war criminals, but you can't use military forces to impose order on territory. You can't use military forces to create military solutions. So it recognizes a role, create political solutions. It recognizes a role for military forces, but nevertheless recognizes the limits of military forces. So, and of course linked to that is the fact that such a framework is very, very dependent on persuasion. It's very dependent on the existence of a global civil society. If the rule of law in the West depended on a kind of bargain with states in which civil society was very important, then in a way, if this is going to be extended internationally, it's going to be even more important, because there aren't coercive global mechanisms, nor would it be desirable if there were them. So that's why the conversation is of such great importance. So if we're talking about spectacle war and new wars representing the outside moving in, then the kind of cosmopolitan framework I'm talking about represents the inside moving out. So is this very idealistic? Well, of course it is. But I don't think that to say it's idealistic necessarily means that it's unrealistic. And I do, in fact, think we were moving towards such a system before September the 11th. And that September the 11th meant a tremendous reversal to that. But all kinds of new treaties and arrangements, particularly the International Criminal Court, were being developed in the period before September the 11th. Of course, subsequent events, and I think both terror and the way in which the Bush administration reacted to that terror represented a terrible blow to this development. But I think what we have seen is precisely the point that I was making, that the US is coming up against limits in Iraq, and it already has been forced, for example, to call in the United Nations concerning the transitional arrangements. And I think what happens is very much a matter of politics and agency. It's not, nothing is predetermined. On the one side, spectacle war and new wars represent, if you like, politics governed by fear and polarization. And on the other side, and I'm probably posing it too starkly, we have politics and power governed to a much greater degree by reason and debate. But to some extent, the limits of what's happening may allow reason a bigger role. And what happens depends very much on politics here, as we all know. What happens here over the next few months? How do people react? Do they think? Do they get scared if terror continues and if things go badly in Iraq, or do they think we need another solution? And that's very much a matter of discussion, debate, argument that's going on at this very moment. Thanks.